It's rough. Yeah.
Well, and today we have Tanya Melendez with us. She's a doctoral student and Illinois Distinguished Fellow at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where her research focuses on the role of television in our everyday life through the lens of rhetorical criticism.
Which
So
I don't expect you to know. Yes. Yeah. Uh-huh. I remember those too.
I really.
Yeah. No, I mean, I am. Yeah, exactly. No, I remember my bunny ears. I'm a little older sometimes than people think. So I do remember back in the day. I actually remember the day we got cable. Oh, it's great.
Oh, I know.
Oh, it's a great day. Oh my God. It was changed everything. Yes. Yeah, it was 1981. I remember. It was a good day. Yeah, no, that was the day I got MTV as a child. So I was beyond. Yeah. Yeah. So that level of television, I have fond memories of her. Let's see if I can actually change these slides. So rhetoric it's a term that we use a lot. I come at it from a really, really, really traditional sense because it literally starts with Aristotle. But I wanted to give you some definitions of what rhetoric is so you have an idea of why we're going to talk about the things we're going to talk about in terms of TV. So essentially, I put up 3 definitions of what rhetoric is, and they all sort of work in concert because nobody has a perfect definition of it. It's not biology or any of the hard sciences. It's communication. So it's a little different, but essentially, these are the biggies as far as I'm concerned, right? It's about how we influence each other. All the ways. That's what rhetoric really is supposed to be. All the ways we influence each other to change our minds. It comes out of speech. So the study of speech is traditionally the study of rhetoric because speech persuades you, right? So that's really what it is. I, competed in college speech. I competed for Bradley's speech team. Yeah. Oh, well, I'm just obsessed with TV. I'm a traditional Gen Xer. I'm a traditional Gen Xer. I was a kid who, I remember I pitched a fit and was able to stay up for the finale of MASH past my bedtime. That was me, right? I was that kid. I used to memorize the TV guide every week and make hard choices. And then my parents would actually they would be having friends over and they would be like, oh no, you can ask her anything. And their friends would be like, what's on Wednesdays? And I would rattle off everything that was on Wednesdays. So that I've always loved television. I didn't get my own television in my room until I was 12 and it was tiny. And I loved it. Which meant I didn't have to watch 21 Jump Street in the living room and be bothered. It was great. So the rhetoric of television, specifically, is how TV actually influences our culture. So that's what I actually study. And that's what my work is in. So television means a lot of things. And how you use it, in a sense, is dependent on what you're talking about. So there's really 3 sort of definitions of television. The first is it's a medium. It's a communication medium, right? And it's a visually based one. So it's a medium. It's a business. Right. $394 billion global worldwide this year is what TV revenue is, just pure revenue. So it's a huge business and it's a mega business worldwide. And then it is an art form and it's narrative storytelling. And it's usually episodic in nature. And that's what separates TV from things like film, is the idea of the episode. So creators of content make a lot of strategic choices. And every time they're making a choice, they're rejecting what else could have been. And that's sort of why you have to think about what are the creators of television choosing to put out there and how are those choices both strategic and intentional to make you feel a certain way, but also to make you look at the world a certain way. So what I'm proposing in summarizing up is that there are 4 ways that television actually shapes our culture. So the first is that it represents reality. We like to think that television represents reality, but it's really representing it, right? So it's a fun house mirror. It's a New York in Friends where there's no Black people. And you're like, how is that possible? And for a long time, people kept asking the creators of Friends, where are the Black people in this New York City? Yeah. They're not there. Yes. And eventually they actually had to do guest casting intentionally to make a love interest of Ross and be a Black woman, Aisha Taylor. And they did that as a response because it's an unrecognizable New York when you don't have different accents and voices and skin colors, right? But that is sort of what we mean by representing it. It's a series, again, of choices, right? So you look at something, and the question you should always be asking is, what's missing? There's a show about Peoria on Netflix called The Prince of Peoria. Yes, it's a kid's show. It's a kid's show about a fictional prince who's in high school, young high school, who has to hide out. So they send him to Peoria from this fictional country to stay with long distance relatives. And now you have this young kid running around, you know, who's royalty in Peoria. The funniest thing is they use establishing shots that are actually Peoria. So we see the city skyline, certain buildings, certain streets, and they are for real Peoria. And then it cuts to inside the school and you're like, there's never been a school that looks like that in Peoria ever, right? Yeah. So it's this thing of what is missing, how are places and people being represented, but not just that, but how's the culture being represented? How are families being represented? How is it all being represented through this lens of the show? So the medical drama, you'll recognize some of these, I'm sure. Dr. Kildare's right there, yeah. The first one is Medic. Medic is a 50s show. It was the very first medical show to show a medical procedure. It was the first one on TV. It was that one. And then Marcus Welby. Yeah, Marcus Welby. So there's Marcus Welby, MD. I didn't put up Dr. Kildare. Yeah. I had to. Yeah, he does look a little bit like him, but no, that's Medic. So there's, of course. Yep. ER St. Elsewhere. That's the 80s show, the big one. It's on Hulu. It's good. And you'll see, if you watch any of these, you see how one leads to the other, right? As things go on. This last one is, so there's Grey's Anatomy and there's The Pit. So this is one per decade from the 50s. Yeah. So one per decade all the way throughout. So this is the big drama, medical drama of each decade. And we all know somebody who works in medicine who cannot watch these shows, right? Like they can't do it. They're just like, nothing makes sense. This is not the way any of this works, right? And this is the constant battle for shows like lawyer shows, cop shows, medical shows, is how do you present something that is quote unquote authentic? Because that's what audience say they want. We don't. We don't want to see authentic representations of these things. It would be miserable, right? And slow, heaven knows, right? An authentic representation of a courtroom, I mean, snooze. And not only that, unattractive. There, I said it. We like pretty actors to play these parts, right? We like pretty people doing pretty things, and we like the drama to be contained. And this is where these choices really, really matter, right? So the show 24, I always ask students who have watched it, I said, great. When did Jack go to the bathroom? Not one time. Nope. And a lot of it, yeah, it depends now. A little more pets and TV. The homes are getting a little more realistic, but the bathroom breaks have never been realistic. 24 was so funny to me. I'm like, this man is running around for 24 hours, single-handedly stopping entire terrorist plots, and he has not once stopped to use the restroom. Right. No, sometimes they showed a meeting. It was rare, but every once in a while. But this is the thing, is like this idea of this tireless, superhero person is part of it. If you show him going to the bathroom, what the people creating it would say is that might make it more real, but you're losing the authenticity of the feeling of someone who won't quit, right? Yes.
Back in the 50s, they wouldn't have wanted to see actual, real medical dramas.
No, but Well, it's interesting you say that because the best example we have of that, and that struggle between authenticity and not, is actually Dragnet. So what happened was, do you know about the Hays Code and the movie code? Great. Okay. So part of those Supreme Court decisions, because there was a couple of them that involved that, was the Keystone Cops era really upset real police people. So the Keystone Cops era, the 20s and 30s in movies, where cops were bumbling little clowns. So they objected and they tried to crack down on studios from releasing those types of films. So it ends up in court. And essentially the court says, that's not protected speech. It's silly. It's inconsequential. So no, they can do that. So the police could routinely raid studios if they thought that they were not being represented well in these types of movies. So when TV rolls about and they decide they want to do a cop show because they're taking it now from the radio, these types of stories, Jack Webb, who created Dragnet, went to the LAPD and said, listen, I really want to do this, but I want to do it. I want to represent you well. I want to be authentic. What will it take for me to have access to police people and police information and police files, so I can pull real cases and I can have real cops in the background and I can do it the way you want to? And they said, okay, you can do that, but we have to have somebody there to what? And we want to read all the scripts and approve all the scripts. And he said, no problem. So Jack Webb would argue, and did argue, that's what made his show popular, was the authenticity. And he would start every episode by saying, these are real stories, right? He was the first one to do that. Other people who study that go, no, that made it much less real because the LAPD is perfect in that show. Not a single lazy or incompetent or malicious, not a single bad act or actor in that show, in the LAPD, in Dragnet. They do the right thing every time. So it's a balance, a struggle between what makes good television and what makes authentic television and what makes people feel like it's authentic has been a battle. Never 100% clear rate. You know who else has 100% clear rate? Mariska Hargitay on SVU. That Law and Order SVU has 100% arrest rate. In real life, of course, that is about 36% of an arrest rate. And that's not going to trial. That's, we've arrested someone for the crime. Yeah. Well, on TV, it's always the right person, right? So this is a sort of recurring thing that goes on in these shows that represent things in criminal justice and medicine and law in particular, right? This fight for how do we make something authentic and yet make it good TV and make people love our characters and feel something for our characters. And in fact, they just did this massive study of young people. So under 18 years old, it was global. It was a global study to figure out what fictional characters they trusted and liked the most. And the highest ranking TV character was in fact Olivia Benson, the main character from Law and Order SVU. Kids trust her. So yeah, and according to the show, they should, right? Oh yeah, well, I mean, yeah, she comes from great stock. Yeah, like she really is. Yeah, she plays it beautifully. No, and it's very, and it feels authentic, even though we know it's not, right?
They always used to say, I don't know if they still do, ripped from the headline.
Oh yeah, they love to. They just did their Diddy episode last week. So, you know, that's very thinly veiled, just changing names just enough. Yep, absolutely. The interesting thing about that representing is that, I will say, is that it does have a huge impact in how we view these industries. So, for example, cop shows, which is actually what I'm working on in my dissertation, people who regularly watch cop shows have a really profoundly, they misunderstand how real cops act. So, for example, the clear rate, we were just mentioning The actual clear rate is in the 30% for an SVU unit. People will highly overestimate that. They will highly overestimate the amount of force used or the amount of police who admit to false arrest or any of those things. So every study has looked at that, has discovered that people who regularly watch police shows absolutely misunderstand this real statistics about crime and policing in America.
How can they be like that when they're out in the real world,
Mm-hmm.
seeing how things are?
Yeah.
Watching the news,
Mm-hmm.
reading the paper.
Yeah.
Can you think television is the way life is? I mean,
Because they don't think of it that way. They're raised on, so people, it's accumulation, right? We see it over and over and over and over and over again. And so from childhood, we see this particular type of cop as a person in our living rooms, right? Yes. So you probably have a much more accurate understanding of policing because you're hearing her stories. Okay.
she
Mhm.
wasn't, I mean, she wasn't like cops on television. She just rode around in the little scooter.
Mhm.
And she carried a badge and a gun and all that, but she just primarily wrote parking tickets because that's what the women did back when she started. They weren't allowed to.
Yeah.
So she drove around in her little putt-putt scooters, I called it, and wrote parking tickets. But she still had a gun and a badge and handcuffs and stuff.
Yeah. And she went through training.
Yeah.
And I'm sure she dealt with a lot being a woman in that field during that time period, right? Yeah.
And that she didn't, because, you know, she was a kid and she didn't want to, you know, talk about it in front of me probably.
Right. There's a weird level of this type of persuasion. We don't realize it's being done to us. We like these characters, we like this show, it's warm, it's comforting, and it influences us slowly over time. And especially if you're not thinking about it with a critical eye. It's just entertainment. We spent a lot of years calling TV the boob tube, right? And it turns out that's not quite right. Because there is a relationship that's happening between us and that television set. And it makes us believe things, even when we don't realize we're being persuaded in that way. So the second thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of influence was how TV influences our memory. And it reshapes our understanding of both events and people. And it's really odd how quickly it works. And what I mean by that is, for example, Vietnam vets who saw TV shows and movies about Vietnam after they came home throughout the 80s and 90s, China Beach, of course, but also movies like Apocalypse Now. And, you know, all throughout the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of media centered in the Vietnam War in different ways. It would sort of overwrite their memories. They would start attaching what they went through those types of narratives. So they would say, instead of saying it was like this and explaining it, they would say it was like Platoon, like that scene in Platoon, right? There became a relationship between those narratives and their own memories of what they had been through. And that's something that this theorist, Jim Cullen, talks a lot about. He has a great book about the way TV makes us remember certain historical events. He talks about the Waltons, among other things, like the Waltons and its image of the Great Depression and what that meant, right? He talks a lot about MASH and how MASH is actually about, of course, it's set in the Korean War, but it's really about the Vietnam War, right? Like that is its parallel. That's what it was trying to do. But it also even more gives us an understanding of the era of the 70s and the way the 70s was the skeptical response to the 50s and 60s, right? Like in so many ways, but in this art form, especially the satire of that era is on purpose, right? It has an opinion. So we understand as people watching it that there's a narrative happening on purpose about not just that war is hell, right? But that the Vietnam War, which was happening while this was on the air, was a mistake. essentially, that it was repeating the mistakes of the past. And we were going to see it through Hawkeye and BJ. So it goes on quickly. These things happen very quickly because the people who are able to write and make and produce television shows are typically anywhere from 30 to 60 years old. So they're responding to the things they grew up with. So those cycles happen pretty fast in TV. SNL has a deep, deep influence on how we think about political figures. I wish it didn't. That's so funny. Have you ever seen any of the sketches out of context?
Once in a while,
Mhm.
not very often, no.
Yeah.
I've just never been a fan.
And that's the thing, it's not everybody's cup of tea. It is in its 50th season, so it's working for somebody. Yeah, 50 years. They tend to pick one exaggerated feature of a political figure and then make it as big as humanly possible. And that has a mixed effect on the public. This era, obviously, in politics is its own beast, but let's go back a little bit. Will Ferrell played George W. during the 2000 election. And if you remember, we thought the worst thing that ever happened to us was that we didn't know who the president was for 33 days. Remember when we thought that was bad? But he's playing W during that time period, and he plays them as this affable dummy. Truly. There's a sketch where at one point, all the Republican players are trying to figure out how to get him in the White House. And it cuts to him and he's playing with a ball of yarn like a cat. This is how they represented him. And what we learned from that experience is that people who watched SNL genuinely started to attribute warmer feelings to George Bush, the real person, from that portrayal. That he was sort of benevolent and, he didn't mean any harm. It's fine, right? Like their feelings changed by watching him. And this is something that they did with almost every president. They would pick one thing and lean into it. And so these things do have a lot of influence in the viewership because they become sort of what we call in rhetoric a synecdoche, a thing that represents the whole, right? So this sort of affable nature of this guy represents the whole real person. And that's sort of where these influences come in. 9/11, I teach college students. First of all, they weren't born yet when it happened. I know. It makes me want to crawl into a sarcophagus every day, trust me. But like, they were not born when it happened. Their memories of it are obviously not their own. Their memories are two things: the stories they get told, the history they were forced to learn at some point, and film and television. And that's how they're building their understanding of 9/11. No. Exactly. And and it's becoming entertainment because that is how, unfortunately, we don't prioritize the understanding of those types of events, right? I think I grew up very much, Pearl Harbor Day was a big deal growing up for us, right? We were forced to read that. We had people come in, World War II vets, Holocaust survivors would come to the school, right? And you would go to an assembly and you would listen to them. These were more common things in the 80s and 90s, right? We're not doing as much of that in public education anymore. It's a problem, right? But one of the reasons why it's a problem beyond that sort of the conversation that a historian would have with you over that, but one of the reasons why I have such an issue with it because it's being substituted through narrative, through fictional narrative, essentially. Yes. Well, it's Holocaust Remembrance Day, I believe, today or yesterday. Yeah, it was yesterday. Yeah. And so, where do these types of narratives fit in? Is it good that TV shows are not pretending like these things didn't happen? Of course, right? But how is that being prioritized, those types of fictional narratives being prioritized over the actual event and the way it impacted real people? Yeah.
I remember
Yeah.
when I was a kid seeing something, a movie of it, and it was an actual honest to God showing everything.
Hmm.
And it was like the most horrifying thing you could ever see in your life, because I mean, it was actual real footage.
Oof. Yeah.
They
Yeah.
don't show that kind of stuff.
No, they do not.
And they should, because kids don't understand.
The horror show of it matters. I'm curious, every TV show pretty much at this point has had some sort of COVID plot line. Especially medical shows, especially shows set in bigger cities, etc. And there are movies based around it now. This is going to be something that again gets sort of taken over by our entertainment. And it's again, the point of this is that you pay attention to these things and go, okay, why or how, and if your niece or nephew or whoever is watching a show and it has a COVID episode, that you go, okay, I know you don't remember, but so these experiences, these collective experiences, they get reshuffled through narrative TV. Yep.
Infected. And that really was what it was.
Or,
That's what it was.
yep. And that's the thing, you don't want it to become our collective memory, but it so often does, right? And so it's something to be aware of. No. And it would be great if we learned any lessons. Remember that? Remember the way we all stressed about toilet paper?
I mean, this was weeks and months of that.
Yeah, it was chaos. I just remember getting like hoarding Lysol wipes. Clorox wipes and Lysol wipes. I live for them. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, now why can't I get, that's why I can't get any.
Yeah.
Is because you're hoarding. And they gotta sign up now at Schnucks that they're limiting the number of eggs that they'll let the people buy.
Well, yeah, because now there's an egg shortage. I'm going to tell you right now, you will watch an episode of TV that replicates that TP disaster. Within the next year, you'll run into it. And you'll think of this moment. Yep. Like it was a Beanie Baby back in the 80s. Oh, yeah.
Over Beanie Babies and
It's ridiculous.
Cabbage Patch Kids.
Uh-huh.
I mean, people got in actually.
And the Elmo, that first Elmo. Yep.
People don't believe that. It's like, yes, people actually did get in fights.
They truly did.
For these things.
They truly did. So the third way television scripts our behaviors. So one of the questions I always ask my college students when we talk about rhetoric of television is I ask them at the beginning, I go, how did you learn what a prom was? When did you learn what prom was? And they inevitably figure out they learned it watching TV. They were, there's an episode at the Disney Channel. No, they learned about it when they were elementary school. They learned about it watching TV. That's what a prom is, right? And that's the sort of thing that you learn from television. It's not just you learn about certain types of places or whatever. You learn about behaviors. You learn about what dating should be. You learn about how parents should sit their kids down to talk about things, right? You learn, right? Oh, no. It goes all the way back to Wally and the Beeve, Mr. Cleaver sitting the Beeve down to have a strong conversation, right? But that is all family sitcoms and family dramas have developed this sort of language about parenting and family that became very much the predominant sort of ideas and the ideal, right? And so it's how do we relate to each other at work? How do we act? How do we dress? How do we converse, right? All of those types of things, it's a loop. People write what they know or what they imagine, right? It gets aired into these TV shows. And then people watch those TV shows and it influences what they do in real life, which influences somebody writing. And it's this sort of absolute circle of influence going back and forth between the real world and the fictionalized versions of that world, influencing each other all the way through. So we get those very special episodes in the 80s, right? that, Tom Hanks as the alcoholic brother on Family Ties, right? It was a special 2-episode event, right? Because alcoholism wasn't really spoken about on TV as a disease until that era. So it becomes a very big deal, right? These types of big, huge pronouncements, they're subtle as sledgehammers, right?
She was a black lady.
Yeah.
Single.
Oh no, we're going to talk about that, and we'll get to number 4, because Julia, yes, it was a big deal, very big deal. But in this case, this is less about that representation, which we'll talk about, and much more about how TV, by the actions of looking at people go through situations, gives us these scripts for our real life. This is an appropriate way, or this way works, or this way doesn't work. And so you sort of imprint on that as you watch these things over and over again of what are the ways that we can communicate with each other. And that has a direct impact on our behaviors, right? But then we're going to get to this. You brought up Julia. Yes. It becomes the very first show starring a Black actress, Diane Carroll, the amazing Diane Carroll. Yes. But yeah, no, Mary Tyler Moore, obviously, the first single gal. She was the starched white nurse's outfit. Yeah.
I need a man in any. Get married? She did.
Yes, she didn't. It's interesting though, because Mary Tyler Moore is an example of all of these things, both good and bad. No, let me walk through this. So the first thing is, obviously representation matters, but representation matters for a couple of different ways. First, obviously, marginalized groups. It makes a huge mega difference to see people who don't look like you, and don't act like you. There is a lot of evidence about the power of that, about the way that representation on television has actually changed American public opinion. One of the biggest is Will and Grace. Will and Grace profoundly affected the way this country thought about gay rights. It is part and parcel with as much as the politics of it all. It is credited with pushing equality rights to the forefront, especially in marriage equality. And it is because it was insanely popular, right? This is still back when hundreds of millions of people were watching the same things. And it was so insanely popular for such a long time. So people who thought they didn't know any gay people all of a sudden felt like they did, right? Which always changes the way that group is represented in our culture. But it also moves issues from the private sphere to the public sphere. And that's getting into a little theory, those words. But essentially what it means is, a lot of times TV shows played a role in saying, this is considered shameful to talk about, but we should be talking about it. So things like spousal abuse, for example, these were things that were considered family issues back in the day, right? You didn't talk about child abuse or spousal abuse, you minded your business. Television and shows set out specifically to try to counteract that with different types of plot lines in various shows, especially in the 80s. Absolutely. Afternoon specials, right? Which were very important for my generation. That's what I was raised on, right? And those things really matter to push things out of this private sphere where it wasn't the community's business into the public sphere where it becomes the community's business. So that's a very important role that television played, particularly in the 70s and 80s, right? Take things out of the shame closet, make them everybody's problem.
So we've got Star Trek in the 60s.
Oh, yeah.
He managed to represent
Oh, yeah.
different things in his way. I mean, my God, the first interracial kiss.
Listen, if you want Sarah Netzley and I to do one of these together, we will talk about sci-fi and its job all day, every day, right? Because that genre, because that genre, and this is something that actually Sarah and I are, Sarah and I are best friends. We live together. We share a house and so our little nerd town house. But yeah, so we will happily discuss genre and the sci-fi influence. Yes, we'll get clips together for that one. But that is a big deal, right? Those types of things very much do change public ideals. Yes.
Smack you in the face and say, hey.
Yeah. Although now that we look back at original Star Trek, and It doesn't feel subtle anymore. It did back then. But it did. Yes.
Didn't know he was representing the Vietnam War.
Yes.
He was not representing racial inequalities and this and this and this, but after 40 some years, well, 50 plus years, people have now analyzed them to death.
Yep.
And
Well,
that's what
I will tell you though, it was doing its job. Just for example, Star Trek. You're right in that a 10-year-old watching that was not going to be able to articulate those things. But what they could articulate is the idea of every culture matters. Everybody counts. And that's enough. That gets you to the next place as you age, right? And that's sort of where that responsibility of the pen really matters. The other thing is that television humanizes controversy. This is really an important role. The AIDS crisis, for example, how it was televised was very important. It started on soaps. Soaps were always the pioneer with social issues, traditionally always have been, because it was an audience that was willing to write these things out.
General Hospital had
Yeah.
that one big storyline.
They did. They were not first, though. It was All My Children first, but General Hospital after. There is a new one coming out.
Yeah.
I'm glad. I'm hopeful for the
I
genre.
think it was a reality show like that.
No, there's a new CBS. It's going to be on CBS and Paramount Plus.
Yeah.
It's a very big deal that they're trying that again. And I think that it's one of the things about that genre that is really important is exactly this. It can be first. It can try things. And they react in such a quick amount of time that if it goes off the rails, they can pivot.
Yeah.
So because of that, they're more willing to take more risk in the actual content. And so the first character with HIV/AIDS appears in All My Children in the early 80s. The AIDS quilt appears on All My Children, the actual AIDS quilt, when it was at the mall in Washington, D.C. You're absolutely right. General Hospital had a multi-year plot line surrounding multiple characters, both living with and dying from AIDS, right? But over time, so they could show the various ways. The invention of the cocktail really matters. And that changes the storytelling because characters could live, which is really important. But also even before that, designing women, Life Goes On. There were plenty of primetime shows that also did that. And what it was doing was constantly humanizing the issue, giving you narratives, and narratives change news stories, right? When you have an idea of the human toll of something, it changes your understanding of the actual real life issue.
To a character on television, you can to somebody on the
100%.
It's strange.
Yes.
I mean, you got Designing Women, I think it was their brother.
It was.
He was gay.
He was gay. He was played by the person who plays Fitz on Scandal. He was not the brother. I want to say, oh my gosh.
I remember one of the characters
Yeah.
did, and they, and it's like.
I can't remember who he was playing.
But even though and they still had a gay brother though. I mean, down in the
Yes.
South,
Yes.
a gay man. Oh my God.
I know. I believe it was Charlene's brother. Yeah. Yeah. I love that show. I just rewatched it a couple of years ago completely because it's on Hulu. So I actually I always have a show that I'm rewatching from the past. And that's the one I did that year, and it was really good. Yes. Although let me tell you, I'm gonna tell you, this is the problem with when you watch shows from the past. You have to, every once in a while you're like, oh no.
They don't date. Sometimes they don't date well.
They don't date well, but also there's definitely blackface on Designing Women. And it's interesting because it was a very 80s phenomenon, the way the blackface is on there. It is that, of course, one character wants to do it, Delta Burke's character, of course, when they're going to perform as the Supremes for a benefit. So she, of course, is like, well, you have to do me. And the others are horrified. And this was a very 80s phenomenon, was get the laughs out of pointing out that the behavior was racist. But they're still showing the racist behavior, which you do not do now. But for a while, that was the progressive way of doing those types of things on television, was to mock them, to make them an object of derision. So yeah, and every once in a while you're watching something older, you're like, oh no, that just happened. And it's very startling. But yes. Okay, but all that said and done, it's not always progress. Television can also do a really good job of reinforcing dominant ideology that is not that is not forward motion, right? Our world after 9/11, the way television reflected that was to very much to lean into federal power. So cop shows went from being local to being federal. So this is when the rise of the NCISs and the FBIs, right? It shows that we're talking about terrorism in a way that was not very well articulated, right? And really trying to reinforce the idea of see something, say something, things should be sacrificed for the greater good, personal liberty should come after what the government says is safety, which are all controversial issues to be sure, but the narratives were very much reinforcing the idea that the measures that any government took in the name of fighting terrorism would be justified. So these things work both ways, right? The narratives can push us forward or back or increase the dominance that already exists or challenge it, right? And I think Mary Tyler Moore is an example of both things at once. Her feminism, her outspoken feminism, being a single working gal in the city, right? Very important. They did. Absolutely they did. But Bonnie Dow, who's one of the very first really big women who studied television and feminism together, right? She has some great books on this. One of the things that she talks about with Mary Tyler Moore is that the problem was that the show then went ahead and recreated all the patriarchal structures that she was fighting against in the workplace. So she has a dad and she has a brother and she acquiesces to the dad. And she has, like, they recreated that structure in the workplace. So even there, despite her savviness and her feminism, yes. So it's a mixed bag, really, when you look at it holistically in that way. Yes. Well, I mean, that cast is a murderer's row. It's the most perfect cast that's ever been made on television. Yeah, like by a mile, frankly. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. You know, and well, I love that episode. It's interesting because Nick at Night served a really great purpose. My little brother it's his birthday today, actually. He just turned 42. And his favorite shows are Mary Tyler Moore and Dick Van Dyke because of Nick at Night, right? They were readily available to him as a child. So he watched them constantly, right? And yeah, so shows can do all of those things at once. And it's an important thing to remember, right? It's never just one thing. Yes. Well, again, we go back to the idea of authenticity, right?
Pants in the Dick Van Dyke Show.
I know. Yes. Yeah. The capris. She made capris happen. Yes. And the flip. And she was so tiny and so cute. Yes. So that's the big message, right? Jeremy Butler, he wrote this 20 years ago. He was talking about from the 40s on. He wrote about the idea that we don't think about it as this, but it is the number one meaning creative medium that we experience. Even now, even with television being on this as much as it's on this, as much as on that, it still is the thing that has the most force in our culture to define our world for us. And that's a really important thing to remember about all of these shows, is that television is almost 100 years old at this point. It'll be 100 in 3 years, because 1928 was the very first broadcast. And in that time period, it has produced more of our culture than almost any other form of communication. Yeah, and it's primarily in our homes, right? Which is the big thing, is that's why, right?
Everybody has a TV.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, so that's what I have. I know. Well, the business of TV is an entire different conversation, right? And news certainly.
Everything. Disney owns this. Somebody else, I mean.
Yeah,
you
the
don't have
consolidation.
stations
Yeah.
owned by these big conglomerates that own everything else.
They are. And there used to be a rule that barred studios that produce television from being the same ones to air it.
Yep.
And that rule was dismantled because as we got rid of regulation in the early 2000s, which is why Netflix can be both a studio and a distributor of its content, right? If that rule still existed, Netflix could not it would be a different thing, right? So this is why Warner Brothers owns so many of the things that were on NBC. It's because NBC had to buy them.
Comcast
Yeah.
owns a bunch of stuff and
Yes.
they're a cable company,
Uh-huh.
but yet they own all these studios.
Yes. So it's a very different environment in the last several years than it used to be. Oh yeah. Disney actually controls about 70% of all entertainment at this point, of entertainment, Hollywood entertainment. Yeah. Yeah. When it's all said and done, it's about 70%. Isn't that wild? Yes.
It's not unbelievable.
Well, it should. I wish it were.
I mean, Disney,
Oh my
sit
God.
there and watch Tinkerbell.
They had to edit out all of his smoking. Remember how he would smoke through all those intros? Edit all out. They
I was
did.
watching something the other day and they were actually smoking a guy
Yeah. Yeah.
and it was a woman.
Oh yeah.
I mean, that.
Again, we're talking about what people want, authenticity, right? Especially if it's gritty or they're a villain. You had a question?
So we talked in some of our other sessions about how news and social media can be
Yeah.
giving you so much polarized stuff.
Yeah.
And people who consume a certain source of news might have a completely different view of reality than someone who consumes a different kind of news.
So
When it
true.
comes to television,
Yeah.
do you find that kind of siloed viewing producing people who have different views of reality?
If we take cable news out of the conversation, talk about narrative TV. Let's just take the new stuff out. Yeah. Okay.
Choose to view this, and so that
Yeah.
gives them a different framework of viewing reality than maybe someone who chooses to watch the show.
Yes. It's interesting because this is a switch from pre-digital and digital. So pre-digital, we all by nature watched pretty much the same things. You didn't have a choice. So television, you would inevitably know people who were watching the same thing, or they would accidentally, or there was nothing else on, whatever, right? So that was different. And back then, no. Then digital happened. No. And I'm talking, we went from in 2002. So let me go back even. In 92, there were 100 TV shows. New. I'm talking about brand new ones that year. In 2002, it was 182. In 2022, it was 600. That is how big. And that is that's new. That's just brand new ones. I'm not even talking about the back libraries. Between the 8 top streamers, just the top 8, and mind you, there are 47 streamers you could get right now in the United States. Like you could sign up for 47 of them. Out of the top 8, there are 35,000 different unique television shows you could access. So as you can imagine, audiences are fractured. And it used to be that TV was like going to the movie. You sort of, what's on, right? It's Friday night, let's go to a movie, pick one. And TV is now like walking into a library. And you are wandering shelves and you pick something that looks good, or by the same author that you like, or the genre that you already like and know. You know those romance readers who only read romance, or those mystery readers who only read mysteries, or or fantasy. There's always guys who read fantasy who only read fantasy books, right? That can exist now in television. You can only watch one thing with one point of view. And the ongoing effect is that your worldview starts to shift. It is a very different world, and we're at the beginning of researching that effect because it is such a more recent phenomena. But yeah, it's always amazing to me when I watch the Emmys because, again, I watch an enormous amount of television. And so that means I've seen pretty much everything nominated for an award. I know that I'm the only one doing that. Like, I understand that, right? The joke is always Apple TV just spending money hand over fist for shows that quite literally about 1% of the television viewing audience is seeing. And that 1% loves it, right? But, you know, the average person is not paying for an Apple Plus subscription to watch a very small library of things produced by that tech giant, right? So the critical acclaim becomes very different from what people are actually watching in mass. Same thing with things like FX. So FX is very award-winning in terms of what they produce. They're the ones who make The Bear, for example, right? So Bear, yeah, Shogun, which was fantastic. Oh my, oh, you really do. Yes, and I remember I had such a childhood crush on that man, Richard Chamberlain forever.
Oh, I did.
Oh my
Everybody
God.
did.
What a dreamboat. Right? So, but that's the thing. It's like, so you should absolutely watch it. It's phenomenal. But how many people are sitting down to watch this 10-part drama, mostly in Japanese, right? Sweeping epic drama, reboot, with nobody they recognize on a premium cable channel, or you have to have a Hulu subscription to watch FX on Hulu, which is a place that doesn't even sound real. None of it does, right? So that's the thing. It's like, because of that, you have these sort of silos that people are in. I know a lot of people who only have Netflix. They pay for one thing. They've got Netflix, right? I know people who still have cable because of sports in particular, right? Live sports is a big thing for a lot of people. Yeah, some people, it's simple.
You have cable if you want to watch stuff anymore.
There it is, right? Right. Well, I don't do cable, but in order for me to see that, first of all, I have a PBS passport, right? Which is the digital subscription for PBS, because nobody's keeping me from Grantchester. I mean, I love that show. Yeah. Which I do through YouTube TV, which is fake cable, right? It's essentially fake cable, right? It's just digitalized, right? But that's the thing. It's like everybody's sort of piecemealing together this menu. And because it costs money, they're piecing together the menu that they know they're going to like. And that, of course, limits the ability for these narratives to change people and reinforces the same echo chamber that we're getting in other forms of media.
Yeah, so saying all these things keep going up, people are going to start dropping.
They are. Well,
Yeah.
There's something called churn in the industry that's really fascinating, which is all of these streamers know when you drop them and when you come back. So what they study is what shows cause people to sign up and particularly re-sign up when they come back. So Netflix, for example, knows exactly how many people are coming back just to watch Stranger Things, to binge it as fast as possible and then stop paying for Netflix again. They know that number, and that number is not insignificant. And a lot of the programming that they create is wrapped around the idea of trying to keep those people. So they're only going to produce so much Stranger Things because, you know, heaven knows it takes forever to film. And so they haven't had a season in almost 3 years. They have a new one coming this summer. And what they do instead, though, in the meanwhile, what they've done is cast the woman who plays 11 in as many things as possible. The effort is keep those people on the service, right? So Millie Bobby Brown gets to star in Enola Holmes, and she gets to star in all these other movies that are made for Netflix to keep her face on that main real estate when you turn it on so that you see her. And so that's to avoid churn, right? All of these artistic decisions being made for the business side. Yeah. I know. And it's 7, so we should stop talking, but it's, it's a huge field, but I hope that you've at least now, when the next time you go to watch them, you go, what is this show trying to do to me?
Entertain me, that's all.